Good evening and welcome to the 23rd in the series of Boston University Great Debates, sponsored by the Department of Journalism. I'm Bob Zelnick, your moderator. Tonight's debate is being broadcast live on the World Wide Web, and for that my gratitude to colleagues Jim Thistle, Sasha Norkin, and Bill Lord. Thanks to those in the audience who braved this snowy April night in Boston to come to this important and interesting. Tonight's question is, does affirmative action in higher education really help minorities? Twice since 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that public universities can lawfully take race into account when making admissions decisions because of a compelling state interest in the educational benefits of diversity. Quotas are forbidden. The mechanism of preference must be narrowly tailored to achieve its goal without compounding the harm to qualified white or Asian American applicants. Of course, minorities are free to shun the elite universities to which some number have been admitted through affirmative action, and to attend instead schools where there is more of an academic match with the majority of students. Some scholars maintain that this relative equality of credentials is likely to be reflected in higher grades and class standing, lower dropout rates, and even some argue better results on professional exams. As you'll see very shortly, supporters and opponents of widely practiced admissions policies have very different opinions regarding what the data shows, let alone the desirability of any particular approach. Let me introduce our debaters this evening. First, the affirmative side. They believe and will argue that affirmative action helps minorities. Our lead debater is James E. Coleman, Jr., a professor of the practice of law at Duke University. He's a Harvard Law School graduate and for 12 years a partner in a large Washington law firm. He's also well known as a critical student of capital punishment. Kenneth Elmore, my friend and colleague, is Dean of Students at Boston University and a former lawyer specializing in education issues. He grew up in Brooklyn, a bit too late, I suspect, to enjoy the boys of summer alongside. A bit too late, I suspect, to enjoy the boys of summer.
Let's go Mets.
What? Mets? What are they? Newcomers, immigrants. Ken Elmore has had a professional lifetime of interest in issues involving social justice. We're going to have a separate debate over whether I was more anxious to have him on the panel or he was more anxious to be on the panel, but that's for later. Dean Provost, one of our two student debaters, is a graduating senior in CAS and the first African American student to be elected president of the Boston University Student Union. Jan, good to have you here. Now for those supporting the negative side of tonight's question. Richard Sander is a professor of law at UCLA. He's a Harvard graduate and received graduate degrees in economics and law from Northwestern University. His special contribution to tonight's debate is a seminal study of law students published in 2004 by the Stanford Law Review, in which he advances the mismatch theory, which holds that great disparities between the entering credentials of students admitted through affirmative action and others actually hurts the intended beneficiaries. Also arguing in the negative is Stephen Thernstrom, the Winthrop Professor of History at Harvard and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's the author of numerous prize-winning studies and books, and one of his most recent is No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning, which he co-authored with his wife, Abigail, also a distinguished scholar. In fact, the Thernstoms recently won a Bradley Foundation Prize of get this, $250,000 for their career-long commitment to equality under law. So those of you who want dinner and drinks afterward, just charge it to Stephen. Finally, our student, and I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Joe Morosik. Joe? Got it? Thank you. That's incidentally spelled M-R-O-S-Z-C-Z-Y-K. His family was very frugal when it came to vowels. He is a CAS senior and president of the Boston University College Republicans. Last semester, the group created the so-called Caucasian Achievement and Recognition Scholarship, which I'm persuaded was a satirical attempt to highlight the group's opposition to racially based programs. Let me go over the ground rules very briefly. We will lead off with the lead debater on the affirmative side. He will speak for 15 minutes. Will be followed by the lead debater on the negative side, 15 minutes. Then each student, beginning with the affirmative, will talk for 7 minutes. Then the third debaters will talk for 10 minutes each. Then we will more or less suspend the debate briefly while you in the audience make points for the affirmative or the negative. Those of you arguing the affirmative side would line up behind the mic to my right, your left. Those the negative side to my left, your right. And then we'll have our 10-minute final presentation by the lead negative debater, followed by the final 10-minute presentation by the lead affirmative debater. Then I'll ask you to divide. Those of you who think the affirmative side won will gather. Where will they gather? I think they'll gather on the right side, my right. Those who think the negative side won will gather to my left, and we'll call a winner and loser of the debate. One last rule. This is modeled after the Oxford-Cambridge debate, since we insist that there be no applause during the presentation. Those of you who can't contain your need to express yourselves can say "hear, hear," or "shame," depending upon your view of what the speaker has argued. And if we observe that custom, we'll all be friends, and then repair for refreshments in the lobby and a trip home through the muck and snow. All right, I'm ready for our first debater on the affirmative side, and that would be Mr. Coleman. Oh, incidentally, I will ring a bell when the debater has 1 minute left, and then I will ring it again when his time has expired. I would ask you to complete your sentence and retire when you hear the second bell. Thank you.
I'll do that. Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I flew up here from Raleigh, Durham, and it was about 70 degrees. I wore a golf shirt, and I got off the plane, and it was raining and snowing, so I didn't expect that. To the question, does affirmative action in higher education benefit minorities? My unequivocal answer is that not only does it benefit minorities, more importantly, it benefits society generally. As you undoubtedly will hear tonight, the assumption of those who oppose race-conscious admissions to institutions of higher education is that the state ought to be indifferent to whom is admitted to these institutions, beyond ensuring that they are objectively the most highly qualified applicants. Diversity, they will say, at least in our most elite institutions of higher education, is secondary. And if it is not achieved without affirmative action, that is unfortunate, some of them will even say, but in the end, okay. This argument is short-sighted and ignores why the state supports institutions of higher education in the first place. A race-conscious affirmative action admissions policy must be judged against the purpose of public education. The threshold question in this debate then should be, what is the purpose of public higher education? And beyond that, is race consciousness necessary to achieve that purpose? And then only finally, whether those who are admitted under such race-conscious policies are helped or hurt by them. Let me be clear that I will not argue that anti-discrimination is the principal or even a principal justification for race consciousness in higher education admissions. Rather, I will argue that the principal justification for such policies can properly be characterized as diffusion of knowledge, so as to spread, in the words of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people. This diffusion of knowledge is the democratic and overarching purpose of public education at all levels. And by definition, in a multiracial democracy, it requires race consciousness to achieve. Every state has a system of public education, and many of them, not just Massachusetts, explicitly say in their constitutions or education statutes that the purpose of the system is the diffusion of knowledge. The Virginia Constitution, for example, declares that government rests, as does all progress, upon the broadest possible diffusion of knowledge, and that the Commonwealth shall avail itself of those talents which nature has sown so liberally among its people by assuring the opportunity for their fullest development by an effective system of education throughout the Commonwealth. The link between public education and American democracy reflects the original intent of the founders of the country. As envisioned by Jefferson and others in the 18th century, the goal of public education is inclusion through diffusion of knowledge, not exclusivity or concentration of learning. Thus, Benjamin Rice of Pennsylvania observed in 1786 that where learning is confined to a few people, we always find monarchy, aristocracy, and slavery. To achieve the purpose of public education in a democratic society, a principal function of the general plan of government, as Jefferson called it, must be removal of obstacles to the broad diffusion of knowledge. In his time, Jefferson believed that the principal such obstacle was poverty. Consistent with that, he proposed a public education system for Virginia that had as its primary goal education of the poor. Jefferson argued that by eliminating poverty as an obstacle to the diffusion of knowledge, Virginia could claim for its people those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use if not sought for and cultivated. Race-conscious affirmative action in higher education serves the same function today. Higher education is the portal through which most of our leaders pass at all levels of our society. Diffusion of knowledge also serves to assimilate diverse racial and ethnic groups into a functioning democracy. This essentially is the diversity rationale of affirmative action in higher education, as reflected in Justice O'Connor's opinion in Grutter, the Michigan affirmative action case. Her opinion and its sensitivity to the importance of diversity have roots in our history. In discussing his proposal for a national university, for example, George Washington argued that the more homogeneous our citizens can be made in these particulars, the greater will be our prospects of permanent union. In this sense, diffusion of knowledge seeks to overcome those differences among citizens, such as religion, poverty, race, and national origin, that we wish were irrelevant, but that we know often threatens democratic self-government. The American revolutionary leaders who believed public education was intrinsically linked to democratic government had in mind a society that was racially homogeneous. As one scholar said, it was a heady vision of a new world in which rich and poor, German and French, Protestant and Catholic, but not black and red, would take part in the great experiment. As a result, the founders had no occasion to consider the diffusion of knowledge in a multiracial democracy. But by its very nature, diffusion of knowledge in such a society requires affirmative action. The exclusion of African Americans and other minorities from the heady vision of a new world was not inadvertent, but by original design, and continued long after the former slaves formally became citizens. One of the principal characteristics of American slavery was a systematic effort to keep slaves in a state of ignorance. As one defender of this system said, "If you teach the black man how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it would do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." What is implicit in that defense of slavery is that education alone had the capacity to end the institution. Following emancipation of slaves, states continued to exclude African Americans and other minorities from their institutions of higher education in order to disenfranchise them and limit their ability to participate in self-government. This was done through policies that directly excluded them by race, as well as policies which had that effect. It has been only in the last quarter century or so that state governments, through race-conscious measures, have made any systematic effort to educate racial minorities to the full extent of their talents and under the same circumstances that white students are educated. That is the goal of diffusion of knowledge, to reach out and educate those whose talents otherwise might not be developed through education at the highest levels and in the most elite institutions that produce our leaders, not just our workers. Diffusion of knowledge through affirmative action, race-conscious and otherwise, is not a remedial device. It is the ultimate goal of public education. A concentration of education among non-minorities undermines that goal, whether or not the concentration results from discrimination. It also subverts democracy, which after all was the principal purpose of the discriminatory policies challenged in higher education cases such as Sweat v. Painter, a case that challenged Texas' attempt to exclude black students from the University of Texas flagship law school. By ignoring the democratic purpose of higher education, the current debate about race-conscious affirmative action wrongly assumes that the issue of who is entitled to higher education is about individual rights. It is not. A race-blind admissions policy in public education would elevate the individual interests of applicants over the fundamentally more important public interests of society in the diffusion of knowledge. In effect, the unstated assumption of those who oppose affirmative action in higher education is that a multiracial democracy can survive with an educational system that might concentrate public education narrowly among non-minorities. They are wrong. Such a race-blind admissions policy directly conflicts with the core purpose of public education. In a society that increasingly is composed of insular, racial, and ethnic groups, such a policy in the long run is self-defeating and undermines self-government. To conclude, as Benjamin Rush said in 1786, where learning is confined to a few people, we always find monarchy, aristocracy, and slavery. To answer the question posed, affirmative action in higher education keeps the descendants of slavery discontented and free. That is its benefit to all minorities.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cohen. The first speaker on the negative side, the lead debater, Richard Sander.
You're watching the great debate at Boston University.
Thank you very much, Dean Zelnick, and thank you to all of you for braving the weather tonight. Let me start by saying I think it's unfortunate that despite the importance and the greatness of having this debate tonight on this topic, the one thing I regret is that we've got 3 black speakers on the affirmative and 3 white speakers on the negative, which can certainly lend itself to the idea that this is a black versus white issue. It's not. Many of the leading intellectuals who developed the critique that I'll be talking tonight include Tom Sowell, John McWhorter, Shelby Steele, and many others who are leading black intellectuals who have done brilliant analyses of some of the evidence that I'm talking about this evening. I think this debate is really about an establishment old guard that's been defending affirmative action for 30 or 40 years, and a new guard that is increasingly saying it's time to look at the results of this experiment and see whether or not they justify the effort that's put into it. I think if we look at that evidence and the numbers underlying the evidence, you'll agree with me that affirmative action has outlived its useful purposes and at the very least needs to be structured radically to try to accomplish the goals that Professor Coleman alludes to. By the way, before I get started, let me also mention that there's an insert in your program that I'm responsible for, and it may not make too much sense because it's missing the first page. But since this debate is so much about empiricism and analytical research, I thought it was important to give you some examples of the numbers that I'll be talking about. So if you look at it, I think you can sort of piece together what's the story that I'm telling there. And there's a bibliography at the end in case any of you want to follow up and do some further reading on these issues. The bibliography includes writers on both sides of the issue. So tonight we're focused on affirmative action in higher education. There's affirmative action used in other areas of society. Generally, I don't think we'll be talking about those. We're focused on the use of racial preferences in colleges and universities. And there are a couple of things I think it's important to clarify right at the outset. By affirmative action, I don't think any of us are talking about things like outreach efforts and programs that aim to interest in higher education people who might not otherwise apply. In other words, this is not about expanding the pool of people who are interested in higher education, nor is it about essentially using race as a tiebreaker between 2 otherwise identical and equally qualified applicants. Affirmative action, as it's used in most realms of higher education today, involves the granting of extremely large preferences. And the first page handout that I illustrates the preferences used in the University of Michigan Law School, a system that was upheld by the Supreme Court in Grutter as constitutional. If you try to describe numerical credentials at a typical law school in America on a scale of 0 to 1,000, the band in which most whites admitted to a given law school, the band of the credentials of those students will fall into about a 50-point range, maybe a 75-point range. But the preferences generally extended to blacks at American law schools average about 160 or 170 points. It's huge. It's not anything like a tiebreaker. We're talking about massive preferences, and massive preferences have massive consequences. A second thing that's really important to keep in mind and understand in thinking about affirmative action is that it is not about socioeconomic diversity. It is, despite the comments that Professor Coleman made, it's really not about giving a hand to the disenfranchised. It's, in America today, overwhelmingly just about race. If you look at the areas that I've done research on, that other people have done research on, that is to say, American legal education as a whole, or the most elite institutions of private learning, you find a very consistent picture. About 50% of the students at these schools come from the top 10% of American society. In other words, in the top 10th of the income distribution, the education distribution, the occupational distribution, they have about half the places at these schools. The bottom half of American society gets about 10% of the places. That means that the relative likelihood of being at an elite school or a graduate school is about 25 to 1 if you compare the top 10th with the bottom half. 25 to 1. That's a massive disparity. It's far greater than the disparities anyone's talking about with regard to race. I mean, in higher education, the general goal is to try to, specific institutions will try to raise the proportion of minorities from an underrepresentation of, say, 2 to 1 to 1.2 to 1 or something like that. We're not looking at anything like 25 to 1 in the area of race. But that's what we face every day in the area of socioeconomic diversity. That's a huge disparity. And, it's often thought that what affirmative action is really about is identifying poor students, those from disadvantaged backgrounds, and admitting them. And the notion is that a disproportionate number of those just happen to be Black and Hispanic because that's who the disadvantaged in our society is. But that's not how it works. Schools don't take into account socioeconomic disadvantage for the most part when they do admissions programs. They take into account race. And SES differences are viewed as kind of an incidental plus. The reason they do that is because of the credentials gap, the test score gap, the grade gap that exists between Blacks, Hispanics on the one hand and whites and Asians on the other. Every school that admits students that's trying to create diversity is concerned about that credentials gap. They want to make it as small as they can, consistent with their goals of diversity. So they admit the strongest students that they can within each racial group. And that leads effectively to racially segregated admissions. And again, if you look at the analysis that I've done of Michigan's admissions, you can see clearly that's the type of pattern that's going on. Groups are segregated by race and then admitted relative to one another within their own racial group. That has the effect of admitting Blacks and Hispanics who are as elite with respect to other Blacks and Hispanics as whites are with respect to other whites who get into these schools. So again, if you just look at African Americans in law schools, you see a 25 to 1 ratio between the representation of those from the top end of the Black economic spectrum and those in the bottom half. So it's really a delusion to think that by using affirmative action, we're creating meaningful diversity based on individual opportunity. What we're doing is we're creating a cosmetic sense of diversity. That leads to a related issue, which is who is really a minority? In the 1960s, when affirmative action programs were started, there was quite a bit of justification because minorities had not been present in large numbers in institutions of higher education. But now, as these programs are entering their 40th years at many institutions, the character of race in America has undergone a dramatic change. Not only do we have many more minority groups than we had in the 1960s, much more diverse minorities, many types of Hispanics, many types of Asian Americans, and so on, but the Black population is increasingly diverse. A recent study by a strong supporter of affirmative action at Harvard Law School found that 70% of the Black students in Harvard Law School did not have four grandparents of African American descent. That is to say, 70% of the Blacks in Harvard Law School were either mixed race or they were immigrants, came from the Caribbean or Africa. So how exactly should we define who benefits from affirmative action? I have a multiracial son. His mother is Black, I'm white. Should 50-50 be enough to get a racial preference? Well, maybe suppose we draw the line 50-50. Well, if you actually look into my son's background, it turns out that his mother had a white great-grandparent. So he's a little bit below 50%. Does that exclude him from race-conscious admissions? Those are the types of distinctions that we have to essentially decide if we're going to use race, that is, an intrinsic genetic characteristic, to decide who's going to get admitted into universities, who's going to receive these very, very large preferences. So those are just a couple of introductory notes about what's going on with affirmative action, what it consists of. The main thing that I want to talk about tonight is the effects on the intended beneficiaries. Because the central problem that we have when we use large preferences is that those preferences translate into disparities in academic performance. If you give someone a large preference, they're going to be at an academic disadvantage compared to their classmates because they're starting out with much weaker credentials. It turns out that things like SAT and high school GPA or the credentials that are used by graduate schools to admit people actually make a difference in performance. So I recently did an analysis of law school performance, and it turns out that half of all the African Americans going to law schools in the United States end up at the end of their first year in the bottom 10th of their class. Let me repeat that. 50% of the blacks in American law schools end up in the bottom 10th of their class. We don't have as detailed a set of numbers for colleges and some other graduate schools, but to the extent that we have the evidence, it's very consistent with this. It's very important to understand that low performance is not a function of race. Blacks who enter schools where their credentials are the same as their classmates do just as well as their classmates. The underperformance is an effect of preferences. So when we talk about the effects of affirmative action, we're essentially talking about choice. We're talking about the choice of admitting students to more elite schools at the trade-off, at the cost of lowering their performance in those schools. That's what all this is about. What makes more sense? To put students in schools where they are similar to their classmates in terms of their credentials, or boost them up to an elite school and accept lower performance as a cost of that. Now, a priori, it's not obvious whether that's a good policy or not. It might be a good policy if students benefit tremendously from having more elite degrees. That could be a net benefit. So the research that I've been engaged on, that many of the other people I've mentioned have been engaged on, is about trying to weigh that trade-off and see how it plays out. There are two types of general effects that I want to mention. One is that something we can essentially call positional effects. And I think these are very uncontroversial. A positional effect comes from a harm of this mismatch, this being put in an environment with other people with high credentials, just from the fact that you're in a low position in your credentials, that you're going to have low grades. So, for example, Elliot Carter at Dartmouth did some research on the persistence in science of students who receive large preferences. He looked at students, he compared black students who went to different schools and had different levels of mismatch between their credentials and those of their classmates. And what he found was that students who had a large mismatch, in other words, who had gotten the largest preferences, were half as likely to persist in the sciences as students who had not received a preference. Why is that? Well, it's kind of obvious if you think about it. If you go to school and you really want to become a chemist when you grow up, and you start taking chemistry courses, but you've got a tremendous credentials disadvantage vis-a-vis your classmates, and you start doing badly in your classes, you're going to panic. Those hard, curve-graded science classes don't seem like the most hospitable place for you to be. You're going to transfer to another major where the grading's a little bit easier and you can at least finish your degree. It turns out that that has a pretty broad and pervasive effect on the persistence of blacks in science. Another study found it has an equally pervasive effect on the persistence of blacks who want to go into academic careers. There's a tremendous shortage of black PhDs in American society. And a lot of the reason is that when students major in their undergraduate areas of specialty, they have academic trouble. Not because of their race, but because of receiving large preferences. That causes them to do worse, and they start thinking, well, if I'm a C student, it really doesn't make sense for me to think about being a professor someday. I'm not going to pursue a PhD program. So it essentially discourages achievement and causes very, very high attrition. And we end up with a situation with very few black PhDs, and most of those PhDs are in one field, education. So I think those effects are fairly uncontroversial. I've seen no published rebuttal or critique of those findings. Maybe we'll hear one tonight, but they're kind of intuitively obvious when you think about them. The second type of mismatch effect that I found a lot in my research has to do with what's actually going on in terms of learning. And essentially, the argument is that if you're in an environment where you're highly mismatched, you're actually going to learn less. The consequence of that, which I've traced in some detail in the legal education context, is that your low grades translate into higher forms of attrition. You graduate at much lower rates, you pass the bar at much lower rates, you get worse jobs when you finish and go into the job market. So this type of learning mismatch dramatically reduces the number of people who end up completing degrees and entering. So much so that there's quite a bit of evidence that the net effects of preferences are actually to lower the number of persons coming out of the programs that we're intending to benefit. If we reduce preferences and students end up going to schools where they face a lower mismatch, they have rates of success that are so much increased that we end up having more members of society who have received that education. To be continued.
Thank you, Richard Sonder. Our next debater on the affirmative side is our student, Dean Provost.
Thank you, Professor Zelnick, and good evening to all. Often people call me Dean Provost in hopes that I'll take over at BU somehow, some capacity as Dean or Provost. But occasionally Professor Zelnick refers to me as Neon Dion affectionately, so I enjoy that as well. But affirmative action in the context we examine today has only been around for approximately 35 years. And it has many interpretations as well as many variations as to how it's been applied. Broadly speaking, the legal characterization of affirmative action is different from the social. From a legal purview, the purpose of affirmative action is not necessarily to compensate for past wrongs, offset unfair advantage, appropriately reward the deserving, or yield a variety of social goods, even though these may be residually accomplished. Rather, its purpose was to change institutions so they could comply with the non-discrimination mandate of the Civil Rights Act. The impetus for altering these structurally poor conditions, however, is socially motivated, and its commitment is to purge the mind of injustice and undue prejudice and discrimination. This is something that we should keep in mind as a characterization. The resolution, as it's read, deals with affirmative action and higher education. But there's a much more profound, latent idea that's there, and that is whatever these benefits that we espouse are they worth the cost? Costs could conceivably fall anywhere along the spectrum that ranges from psychological to structural issues, but all pale in comparison to affirmative action when we look at the reality of the situation. To move away from the philosophical underpinning of the social ideas for why we have these legal mandates forever dooms America to the ills conversing with racism, prejudice, and discrimination. At the end of the day, it's simply wrong to ignore the racial component in the continued unequal treatment of blacks in America. Race means more than just skin color. It means either privileges and benefits that follow a certain group, and/or it means disadvantages and liabilities. Not surprisingly, given what we know about U.S. history, those two things end up being somewhat tied and, in most cases, inextricably correlated. President Johnson, in describing affirmative action, stated, "You do not take a person who has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, and bring him to the starting line of a race and say, 'You are free to compete with others,' and still justly believe you have been completely fair." Thus, it would appear clear that it's not enough to just open the gates of opportunity, which is what it seems like the opposing side would like to do. Although idealistically this is beneficial, in reality we see that it's much more complicated. Further, even though America has taken this incomplete approach to affirmative action, we do see myriad benefits on our side. Also, it seems cursory to say that, as OP has done, that 35 years is enough time to gauge properly where America has come in terms of affirmative action, especially considering that we've had hundreds of years of discrimination and racism, segregation, and the gambit of racial injustice. But further, it appears even more cursory and sad to say that if I can't trace my great-grandparents or a few of my grandparents back 4 generations to have them be find that they were African American or of some other racially discriminated minority, that then I am less discriminated against today. We think that the stigma still exists, and this is something that they have to defend on their side to show how, in some way, over the course of time, there has been a lessening of this prejudice and a lessening of this discrimination that's taken place. Justice Thurgood Marshall, after the University of California Regents versus Bakke decision, wrote, "The position of blacks today in America is the tragic but inevitable consequence of centuries of unequal treatment." Marshall wrote in June 1978 that the benchmark of comfort or achievement meaningful equality in America remains a distant dream. He cited U.S. Census and Labor Department data in 7 categories, including the percent of black representation in the 5 elite professions. Here's what he found, updated with today's standards. In 1978, the life expectancy of a black child was 5 years shorter than that of a white child. Today, it's 6 years. 25 years ago, a black child's mother was 3 times as likely to die of complications during childbirth as a white mother. Today, it's 3.5 times. The infant mortality rate for blacks was twice that for whites. Today, it's more than twice. In 1978, 4 times as many black families lived with incomes below the poverty line as whites. Today, the ratio remains unchanged. For black adults, the unemployment rate was twice that of whites, and for black teens, it was 3 times. Today, both statistics remain unchanged. The median income for the black family in 1978 was 60% of the median income for white families. Today, it's 66%. And similarly, we see gains in professions, but when we look at other categories for whether or not there has been substantive change, we can see that in many ways it falls short for the quality of life issues that we talk about. It's not just about getting a profession. It's not just about PhDs and dentists and doctors and lawyers. It's also about the quality of life that people are able to live. Today, white males comprise 29% of the workforce and 95% of all executive positions. Even though there have been gains, Thurgood Marshall's prophetic statements remain true. Benefits can only be gauged by cost, and though we're not here to talk about why affirmative action is necessary, a brief commentary is important. We do have affirmative action in other things like farm subsidies, Social Security, etc. We're not going to discuss those today, but the reason why those exist is because our society has determined that there is a larger public good that's essential for accomplishing, and as a result, we think that it's beneficial by having these sorts of programs. No, Congress has never issued any such decree for racial treatment. The closest thing we've came is to overall treatment with the 14th Amendment, and that's fine. At the same time, there's still progress that needs to be made. Though some argue that race is no longer relevant, we see that relevancy is determined by purpose. And if it's the purpose of anybody in society or any government to say that this thing is beneficial or this thing is not, then we think that it immediately becomes relevant. Similarly, if a nation thinks that it's important to change white institutions so that they're not so uniformly white because it's not reflective of our nation and its skills, then we think that that also makes race important as well. It seems interesting that many, including on the opponent's side, speak of the psychological effects that black people face if they are unprepared or if they question the merits of advancement. Unfortunately, we don't see these same concerns when we talk about the similar plights. Society, at its own peril, would be foolish to expect that those benefiting from the benefits of an inefficient system are going to willfully change those things. It'd be the equivalent of having a Wall Street broker make the market efficient so that he couldn't make gains on its inefficiencies. It doesn't make sense. There needs to be, at some point, a correction of these things. And as far as racism goes, this isn't to relegate anyone to any sort of second-class citizenship or anything of that nature. But the main thing that's often not touted enough in our time for why affirmative action is necessary from the perspective of minorities is that it is evidence of the commitment of white people and those who have done wrong, as is often showed in the past, to correctively take care of a measure in the same way that someone who was convicted of a crime and then found to be innocent, the same way we'd pay our tax dollars today for their crime that was done 20 years ago. Today, we need to pay for what's going to happen in the future for the African Americans and people of color and minorities in higher education. Thank you.
I almost tackled you. I've always maintained with pride that we lose very, very little in quality when we go from the lead debaters and number 2 debaters to our students, and this presentation was vindication of that. Our student debater on the negative side of tonight's question is Joe Mrasa.
Thank you, Professor. The question, does affirmative action in higher education really benefit minorities, admittedly poses a difficulty for our side of the argument. As the black intellectual Shelby Steele said, "How do you say I'm against the policies designed to help you, but I'm not against you?" Sure, having special programs specifically designed to help admit more minority students will help them get into college. But the question is whether these programs, while they may help some minorities get into higher education in the short run, are truly beneficial to minorities overall. I argue that race should not be used as a tool in admitting students to a university. To use race belittles the applicant's achievement and even cheapens the educational experience if students are not admitted based on merit, but based on the university's desire to construct a racially diverse campus. Now, proponents of affirmative action say that these programs exist to redress racism that some minorities feel throughout their education and throughout their lives. I do not deny that racism exists in America today, because it does, but race is not the only basis for discrimination today. People are discriminated against for a variety of reasons, from body weight and appearance to religion and political beliefs. Socioeconomic inequity amongst different demographics has existed in this country and undoubtedly will continue to exist. But to try to adjust for racial discrimination by implementing affirmative action policies, which the courts have deemed as an illegal use of affirmative action, does nothing to truly address inequity. Universities send minorities the wrong message about education, essentially saying that they are an asset to the university not because of their academic strengths, but because of the color of their skin. It tells them that their only value is their race. And until affirmative action programs cease to exist, minorities will view themselves as merely a member of a race and not as an individual who is capable of competing with whites on the same playing field. And minorities seem to agree with that sentiment. In a 2001 Zogby poll, 65% of African Americans were found to oppose racial preferences in either hiring or college admissions. 65%. I believe this is because African Americans realize that they can compete with whites and no longer wish to be classified as a race that needs assistance in achieving. They are beginning to bite back on the liberal, multicultural hand that has fed them for decades. Now, of course, there are socioeconomic disparities today, and not everyone goes through life with the same access to opportunity. Now, some of you may be saying, well, that is just what affirmative action is designed to do, to give every individual of every race the same opportunity. However, I argue that equality of opportunity should not be defined by racial admission policies of our nation's universities. Equality of opportunity comes from families, in local school districts, and with teachers. We will see equality of opportunity when all students of all races are able to go through a school system with strong teachers, good reinforcement at home, and schools that can provide the necessary supplies for its students. We should work on improving educational opportunities for low-income families and improving schools in low-income districts, but we should not be adjusting outcomes while turning a blind eye to the true problems of educational inequity, which are financial and not racial. Affirmative action is a cheap way of addressing unequal access to educational opportunity, and the time and effort would be better spent in improving education at the local level. A second reason that proponents of affirmative action often put forth is that it helps to increase diversity on campus. But if we think we need particular members of other racial groups in the classroom, that creates the worst sort of tokenism and belittles the minorities who are admitted for just this purpose. We should not be concerned about whether there is the correct percentage of minorities at our universities, but we should be concerned about a diversity of opinions, a diversity of thoughts, and a diversity of beliefs. There is certainly not much of a diversity of opinions on college campuses today, and as a conservative, I can speak with some authority on that matter. Having a lively debate in the classroom with students from a diversity of opinions serves to educate the student more so than merely being able to sit next to a minority student. Treating minorities as a number, as a percentage, a means with which the university can claim diversity is grossly immoral and is an astounding insult to minorities. So what purpose, then, does one's race serve in the classroom? Is the academic insight that a minority student brings to the classroom contingent solely on the color of that person's skin? Now, sure, diversity of races at a selective institution is valuable, but not forced diversity. We should applaud the achievement of all people and of all races, but not blindly worship at the table of forced multiculturalism. Seeing someone as merely a member of a race, as a means to supposedly enhance the reputation of a university, is insulting and it is degrading. We as a society need to question the purpose of forced racial diversity and think about what diversity on a college campus really should mean. A third reason I've heard from proponents is that affirmative action, along with race-based scholarships given out by a university, serve to help minorities that cannot otherwise afford to pay for a university education. Now, I have no problem with programs set aside to help those students who can't afford a university education, but race should not be a factor. Students of all races come from low-income families and should be just as eligible for the same programs. However, as Professor Sanders' studies have found, blacks going into law school receive twice the grant aid that whites from similar socioeconomic status do. A poor black student, though, should be at no greater advantage or disadvantage than a poor white student regarding financial awards. To give a black student specific privileges because of their skin tone is simply wrong. To give someone aid based on their skin color and not on merit or financial need is a gross injustice and has no place at a university. We must shift society's desire for racial diversity in our jobs and in our schools to a desire for the best qualified person for the position. We should stop worshiping racial balance and start praising achievement regardless of race. Racial preferences are not the progressive ideas like their defenders would love to claim. Indeed, they maintain the status quo, not looking forward to end racial divisions in this country, but rather they dwell upon difference and inequity, and at the same time promote difference through the same programs. We are, though, seeing a trend towards ending racial preferences at our universities. They are illegal at public universities in Michigan, California, Florida, and Washington State. People are beginning to realize that these programs are not working and no longer serve a purpose in higher education. It is clear to many that affirmative action cheapens the abilities of minorities, since they are reduced to a member of a race rather than a person with unique credentials and individual stories. Race itself is entirely a social construct, so therefore we as a society must work to destroy racial divisions. But racially based programs like affirmative action do nothing to break down the walls between races. Affirmative action does not benefit minorities as much as it may seem, and it serves no purpose in higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next debater on the affirmative side of the question is Dean Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Chairman, this is the deadest audience I've ever seen before. I hope we can get a few hears, a few amens, or whatever you want out of you here. Secondly, I find it amazing that we haven't made a funny joke about what we've set up here. I find that we could start something that says, so I go to this debate about affirmative action, and I go in, I sit down, and there are a bunch of black guys on one side and a bunch of white guys on the other side. And instead of a debate breaking out, a basketball game did, right? I think, for me, one of the great people who informs me is Ralph Ellison. And to me, this has got some Ellisonian quality to it that he would have written about. Let me also say that while we think about what informs me, it's important that you should also know that I'm one of these people who thinks that we've left too much of this debate up to legislators, politicians, lawyers, economists, and intellectuals, and you get the kind of quality, boring debate that we've had thus far. What we have got, thank you, sister. What we've got to do is to get more plumbers and teachers and postal workers in on this debate. What we've got to do is to get more tea workers, delivery people, students, and poets in on this debate. This is a debate where there's got to be a moral consensus in the society and not one at this highbrow level with numbers. You will not hear a whole lot of numbers from me. You're going to hear about what informs me. It's Ralph Ellison, it's Toni Morrison. What informs me is the letter from the Birmingham City Jail, Václav Havel, and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Let me also say this, while we're talking about personalities and personal traits, I should say, in our life stories, I should tell you about my bias. I am one of those people who will say that education probably saved my life, literally. I'm one of those people who grew up in projects in Brooklyn, New York, and they were projects. They like to call them model homes, but they were projects, is what they were. We were poor folks, and I grew up with something that was interesting in my life. Interesting because I had a grandfather who more than likely was a slave and a set of parents who more than likely grew up as sharecroppers. They liked to keep it nice and neat and to say they grew up on a farm, but they were sharecroppers, poor people. Education was something that saved my life. My guess is that someone plucked me out and gave me a shot, probably took an affirmative step of some sort to say to me, Ken, I want you to go out there and do well, and be sure to bear witness to what we've done to help you out a little bit. Be sure to bear witness to a good and just society that is trying to do the right thing when they see some talent and probably a little good look as well. But I think that's important because there are a lot of people out there like me. Look at our governor of the Commonwealth, who also, I think, shares my story. He is there because he's competent. He's there because somebody gave him a chance, and he probably came from some of the background that I have. We all have that story, and it's important that we keep track of that. Let me say this about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's that case that you keep hearing about the admissions practices for the selection of undergraduate students at the University of Michigan. And we know that the Supreme Court weighed in on it, and I think Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg challenged the American society to consider whether or not it's overcome an overtly discriminatory past and the effect of years of government-sanctioned inequality within our communities and schools. There you go. There's the debate right there. She gives us that challenge, whether the removal of law-sanctioned segregation has in fact eliminated segregation and improved our schools and communities. It's still an important consideration. I think that it runs counter with two things, and I'm surprised that the opponents have not brought up Martin Luther King. They love to throw him in your face. They love to say, but then you talk about the content of our character and the colorblind society. I like to remind people that during the time that Martin Luther King was talking about a colorblind society, he was saying, let me just have a society that's colorblind on legal and social sanctions against me. There is something about having a fully integrated society and a colorblind society. Ginsburg talks about the fully integrated society because we know that a fully integrated society is better. I'm surprised the opponents also haven't said, give us a society like it used to be, where black folks were in a middle class and they lived by themselves and they did well. We could do that again. Well, we know that the distribution of resources in the society, when you do it along racial lines in segregated ways, has not worked real well, not the society I want to live in, and I think it presents a real issue. I am not sure that I want to live in that society, particularly when let me back it up. We should not, and we should be ashamed of a society that still exists, and I'm not sure I would want a society that still exists, where we did not get legal and other societal pressures for change. Pity the poor society where all we do is stack people up from the best test score to the worst test score and draw a line somewhere where we want it and say those people who rise above this line are in, and those other people got to figure out where else to go. Pity the university that exists in that way. Pity the boring, sad university that would exist. Let's acknowledge the elephants in the society's room. And those elephants are that when you look at gaps and you take it about race, and by the way, to my opponents, it's about race. We could not have this conversation without people saying the black intellectual, the white intellectual, this or that. It's about race. You're all careful not to say it, but it is about race. And let's look at race. And particularly when we look at employment, income, education, health, and crime, race is all over that. And those are the elephants in the room that we refuse to have good, solid, nasty, noisy conversations about. So let's have them. Now, this is not only about black and white solely because of this. It's about women, it's about ethnicity, it's about immigration, it's about those people who are the others in the society. This is about race because Toni Morrison, again, gets it right. I can't do justice to it, but she says that the staging ground for the American society and the American identity is race. Let's face facts, folks. We fought a war about this sort of stuff. We're still dealing with this stuff. We had levels of segregation in the society that were brutal for years. It's about race. Would we look at South Africa today and say, it's not about race? Let's get real here. And in terms of creating meaningful diversity, which I heard someone on the other side say, meaningful diversity would mean, meaningful diversity, that term would mean more, of course, than just getting numbers of people in rooms. Meaningful diversity means that people have conversations with each other, have quality interactions with each other. But you can't get that if you don't at least get the people in the room. So you do have to do some things on race. I wish the opponents, and Joe did a little bit about that. That's why I like Boston University students. He did a little of this. Usually opponents won't want to get right to where the real focus should be. And again, let me remind you of those real foci: employment, income, health, crime, and education. The problem is that we got a problem with all those things. And Joe hit upon that. I'm pleased. No, this is not about simply the numbers. You know what it's about? It's about the fact that education in the society has changed, and we're all a party to it. Education has changed from a place where people go to explore and grow and get to meet each other and understand each other, and where we try to pluck people and put them together so that they can have these kinds of interactions, and where the society is deliberate about saying, go to an educational institution and make sure that you have these conversations. No, we've decided that education is about jobs now. No, we've decided that education is about rankings and prestige, and it's not about a higher sense of purpose, that being trying to make sure that we've got good societies and good democracy. We've lost sight of that. Now, one of the folks on the other side had mentioned that it's not just about the percentages of blood, and where do we draw those lines? I don't know if I've seen the good professor's children, But there's something that tells me that in this society, if you look dark, people consider you black. There's something that tells me that in this society, if you look black, you're still dealing with humiliation and rage that goes along with that, and you will still deal with those issues of employment, income, health, crime, and education. Something tells me that that is still there. And I hope that we can get into more discussion about this thing called the meritocracy and merit. I ask you all the question whether or not it's ever been about merit, and if it is about merit currently. I'll yield my time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And the final speaker, this time on the negative side, is Stephen Thernstrom, Professor.
Well, I'm sure I will seem quite boringly academic after that spirited performance by Dean Elmore. We do have a different mindset or mentality. I think he believes that telling an anecdote, his own life history, somehow counts as evidence. Now, he didn't really tell us enough about his life history for me to begin to think that even establishes that one case makes a case for affirmative action. He grew up in projects. Did he attend a college where he received heavy racial preferences? We don't know. But the real question, in any effect, is not his experience, but what the experience of African American students in general at elite institutions who are at those institutions because of heavy racial preferences. First, I would say, why is it that there are policies that grant heavy racial preferences, that admit students who would not otherwise be admissible? And the fundamental fact and the starting point in my thinking about this, and I've done a whole book on this called No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning, is that a wealth of evidence shows that at the age of 17 or 18, the average black student in this country today performs at the 8th grade level in reading and a little below the 8th grade level in math. So there is indeed a real shortage of highly qualified black applicants to college. Why is that? Are blacks, innately unable to learn and compete? Obviously not. This points to a scandalous failure of our K through 12 educational system, and in No Excuses, we develop a series of proposals that would address that. And I think it is frankly shameful that our great urban universities, like this one, like Harvard, the University of Chicago, Columbia, UCLA, are all located in places where you have big city school systems which are dismally failing minority pupils. And instead of appeasing their conscience by admitting some more black students under racial double standards, that's a cheap solution. They should be devoting their resources to improving the Boston public schools and the Chicago public schools, the rest of them. They have great schools of education, they have many resources, but they have been notably absent from the serious debate of how do we reform a failing urban public school system. Second, I noticed that Professor Coleman offered a philosophical and historical discussion defending the principles of diversity and of the diffusion of knowledge, and somehow he believed from those principles enunciated by Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and everyone else, we can come to the conclusion that racial double standards and admissions at selective institutions are a wonderful thing. Well, I think this really proves, because in fact our most selective institutions of higher education are not, the student body and the faculty are not representative of the American population. At my universities, 20% of all students are Asian Americans, though they are less than 5% of the total population. At least 20%, probably closer to 30, we don't have numbers for it, are Jewish, though Jews are 2% of the American population. And Dean Elmore referred scornfully to meritocracy. What is meritocracy? That's meritocracy. When you have a group like Asian Americans or Jews who have an unusual commitment to education, the children work very hard in school, and they end up getting greatly disproportionate share of places at elite institutions, and Harvard is perfectly typical here. I imagine BU has a very large Asian student and a very large Jewish student population too. Furthermore, all of these institutions have an overwhelmingly middle-class student body. I once did an analysis of the Harvard class of 1986. There were more children of lawyers, doctors, and professors, that tiny category, about 1.5% of the labor force, than there were children from any kind of blue-collar or farming background, which is half the population. So if, in fact, you want diffusion of knowledge and diversity, you would have to totally change the admissions policy at all of these elite institutions. Perhaps Professor Coleman would favor going back to the infamous Jewish quotas that were prevalent in in private schools from the 20s through the 50s, where they had a ceiling on Jewish enrollment of 5%. That preserved diversity. It kept Jews from gobbling up all of these places. But my view is if Jews and Asians or other groups meet the highest academic standards, then I don't give a damn what the numbers are. Whether that's not representative of the population doesn't matter to me. It's certainly white Christians, and in particular evangelical Christians, are grossly underrepresented at Harvard and many other places. So we would need to have an admissions policy that took all of those elements of diversity and would disavow meritocracy. The other thing that strikes me is that so far, at least, speakers for the affirmative have dealt with broad principles but have not addressed the core question, which is it really good for a group of people to be placed in or given the choice of entering an institution where they are very likely going to be concentrated at the bottom of the academic ladder? Professor superb research on this demonstrates the perverse effect at the law school level that racial preferences by mismatching students to institutions very likely reduces the total number of minority lawyers who graduate, who pass the bar exam, and entering the profession. So it is a feel-good policy that assumes you should go to the best school you can get into. Now, we have a good deal of research suggesting, no, you shouldn't go to the best school you can get into. You should go to the school where you will be at least an average student. The great Harvard sociologist David Reisman started his career as a law professor and had many students who were saying, what law school should I go to? I got into Stanford and I got into Cornell. And Reisman always said, don't go to the best of the law schools that let you in. Go to that law school where you have a good chance to make the law review. It's better to be at a lower tier law school and be a star student than it is to be at the most elite institution and a marginal one. And it's exactly this phenomenon, Rick Sanders talked about it some, that explains this weird paradox. Many of the most gifted African American students in America today are attending, Harvard, Yale, BU, etc. But if you look at what institutions, what colleges are producing blacks who get doctoral degrees to enter the academic profession, it's astounding. The top 9 institutions are all historically black colleges, small, poorly funded, in many disadvantages. And then the 10th one is not the University of Michigan, it's Wayne State. Now, Wayne State is a mediocre place by comparison with the University of Michigan, but it has a large black enrollment, and black students who go there are more likely to get a PhD than those who go to Yale. So this I find telling. And the final comment, I was somewhat disturbed by Dr. Coleman's rather dismissive comments about individual rights. You don't have an individual right to anything, society's need for diversity trumps that. That is, I think, the logic of the Jewish quotas of old, and it would be the logic of some policy which declared we can't let all of our top universities go to and the Jews. We need to have a more representative body.
Thank you. Now we're going to give the panelists time to relax, catch their breath. And those of you who have opinions on one side of the issue or the other, the affirmative side to my right, your left, the negative side to my left, your right. Please limit your statements. These are debaters' points or arguments that you make. They are not questions directed to members of the panel, but the statement that you wish to make. Go ahead. You can start off with your name if you'd like.
All right, good evening or good afternoon. My name is Ricky Junquera. I am a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences, political science major. And obviously I'm on the side of pro-affirmative action. I'm a Cuban-American, first-generation college student coming from Miami, Florida. And down there you would say that the minority difference is not as great. But coming, like a story like the Dean of Students gave earlier, I came from a public high school in the city of Miami where we had bused students come from Florida City and Liberty City, if you know the area, of purely African-American students being bused into our high school, not forced busing, but it allowed them the opportunity to come into a culturally diverse atmosphere. I would first like to talk about Mr. Thurstrom's K-12 education is bad topic and his opinion on that. I believe that yes, there is a problem with the K-12 schooling, and you gave the example of cities like Boston, where most of the white population can go into a private institution and get their education privately, leaving the schools predominantly black in the cities and outside city, and how that might be a double standard. You talked about Harvard's popular Jewish quotas of the 20s and 30s, trying to reject Harvard students who were Jewish from being able to attend the university, as well as talking about how it's really good for students to go to a university that's more of an average university than an more elite university. And I would just like to say how I think that being a Latin American student and a minority at a what I would say elite university here in Boston is a lot better for a student like me, and says a lot more for my people and my friends back in Miami, where only 5% of us actually left the state of Florida to reach our education in another state. And for myself, I chose Boston University because it's in the Northeast, and because the education is different than what I would receive in a predominantly Latin environment. And I think that is the important part of affirmative action. It gives the possibility for students like myself to be able to go into an environment that is not used to a person like me and be able to receive an education that would not be available to me at a predominantly African American institution or a predominantly Latin American institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to this side.
My name is Kasha Zabava, and I am a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences studying political science and in comms studying journalism. I don't really have a question, but more of a thought-provoking, I guess, comment. As I sit here listening to both sides make their remarks, I wonder whether there's a timetable for the policy of affirmative action to ever end. It just seems that this policy continues this vicious cycle of racism, and it pits one race against another, putting focus and highlighting the color of our skin without ever truly finding the goal of ending affirmative action policies so the level field is actually equal. It just seems that the policy of affirmative action will continue, but there's no goal in sight of ever ending this policy and ever having treatment of equality between men and women in a society.
Not to participate in the debate, but to answer a question with a fact. In her majority decision in the Michigan case, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor projected an end to affirmative action in education for 25 years down the road. Well, there's a friend of mine.
Hello.
Good evening, Caitlin.
Hi, Professor Zelnick. So my name is Kaylin, and I am a junior at COM. And this is my statement. So affirmative action has its drawbacks, and it does have a stigma attached to it. But statistics have shown that affirmative action does work, and people have had opportunities where they hadn't before. The U.S. has discriminated a group for 200 years, and it's only right to reverse it. You can't expect a group to fully recover and have autonomy when they've been suppressed for so long. The nation has to start confronting the broader issues of race, and racism is an underlying factor in our society that we can't ignore. Native Americans were discriminated against for so long, and where are they now? For my sociology class, I did a presentation on suicides, and it's proven that American Indians, I think that's the PC term for it, commit the most suicides, and why is that? It's because they don't feel socially integrated within our US nation. So that just shows how important diversity is. I'm a proponent of affirmative action, as you can see, but like all good things, I know it has its flaws. It's not perfectly efficient, but it has great intentions. And I believe that until there is universal education within the United States with good resources for everyone and good schooling, affirmative action is justifiable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Smith, and I'm a student in COM. I'm a senior this year, and I just want to make a general point. There have been a lot of realities that have been talked about on both sides. Both sides seem to agree that social values are important. I think we can all agree with what Mr. Coleman said about how slavery was despicable, and what Mr. Provost said about how affirmative action hasn't really had a long time to develop, and we haven't really seen all the results yet. But I also want to point out another reality, and that is that the corporate world really doesn't give a damn. And the purpose of higher education is to teach skills that you can use in the work world. And if these black students who are being put in these elite schools are graduating to the bottom of their class, then they're obviously not mastering the skills that they've been put into the university to learn. And I think that whether it may be fair, it may not be fair, or it may not be right, but just having Stanford stamped on your resume isn't going to allow you to succeed in the corporate world. So I guess my general point is that if you're not making the grades because you don't have the information, then you're not going to succeed. The world just moves too fast, and you're going to get pushed aside anyway.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Josh Gee. I'm a senior in the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Communications. One thing I just want to mention briefly that seems to have been glossed over by both sides is taking affirmative action as the one thing keeping college admissions from being a pure and virtuous meritocracy. As someone who's went through the process 4 years ago, as someone who has a sister going through it right now, I mean, obviously I'm white from upper middle class suburb. I didn't really have any of that going for me. I also can't throw a curveball, I can't play the tuba, I didn't speak French, I didn't write an essay about when my dad died, I'm not from Alaska. The millions of things, or the thousands of things that go into being accepted into college, saying that this is the one we should be obsessing over or even wasting too much of our time on this particular issue seems to be a little short-sighted, or I don't know. But it's a bit of a mess, so why should this be so important?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcella Sapone. I am a junior in both the University Professors Program and in the School of Management. And let me tell you, it's kind of scary to be on this side of this room because it kind of alludes to a false moral consciousness. Maybe I'm a Republican. Maybe I want to be colorblind to race selectively for my own moral agenda. I'm Hispanic American. It's kind of disturbing that we haven't mentioned Hispanics in this whole debate. I have gone to inner city schools my entire life. My mother is a teacher. And so I feel the impact and I feel the need for a policy which will benefit minorities. But this policy should not be measured on its intentions, but on its end goal. And is it successful as it is today for those it is wishing to serve? And I agree wholeheartedly that it is for the minorities and for our society in general. Unfortunately, this side of the room isn't offering a policy to substitute what is present today. And I feel that is why we're having this debate today. But really, I think the answer that we all acknowledge to ourselves is that affirmative action as it exists today is not truly working. And if you look at the applicants who are coming in and getting opportunities unjustly, you really ask the question, is it fair? Because I could technically mark off on my application that I'm African American because I have two grandparents that are African American. Is that fair? Are people using this policy to get into these elite schools? Are we really targeting the minorities who are in the inner city and getting them the education that they deserve and have the capacity for? Are we really going to solve the problem in higher education, or is it in lower education? Is it in elementary schools? Is it giving our students, both white and black and Hispanic, the opportunity to have diversity at the lowest level of schools?
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Corey Kalanick. I'm a senior in CAS, and I'd like to talk about 2 points. First, I think it's right that we have discussed the purpose of education tonight, and I think that we've seen a lot of different things from both sides. If we want to go with the first definition as talked about by Dr. Coleman, he discussed education as being the diffusion of knowledge in a democratic society. And what we've seen from this debate tonight is that if we are truly to involve everybody in our democratic society, then the affirmative side has the appropriate solution in that it's integrating experiences, it's integrating people of all different types in our educational system, but it's doing so that they can go back out into society and diffuse this knowledge. And I think that that is the important point of that type of definition. But secondly, if we talk about it as a meritocracy, as Mr. Morozic did on the negative side, we have to realize that that assumes people going into the system are going to have equality of opportunity. But we realize that's simply not true. People going into these systems right now are disadvantaged when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to economic backgrounds, as Dean Elmore pointed out to us. And these gains, these substantive gains, have not been made to ensure that a meritocracy is even possible. A third definition of education, which is touched on by one of the speakers on the other side, was that of getting jobs. If getting jobs is the most important thing, then we can realize that going to Harvard or going to Boston University is most likely going to get you a better job than going to a community college. That's most likely going to get you a better job than having a high school degree and nothing else. And what we see from that is that these opportunities must be provided to people in order for them to step up and in order for them to gain substantive ground in society. But the second point I really want to talk about is this idea of a solution, because Dr. Thernstrom pointed out a solution for us. He said we must rectify the wrongs in our K-12 education system. And I certainly agree with that. That's a valid point. There are other solutions out there, such as socioeconomic affirmative action, and I'm not sure that they get to the meat of the problem. But I leave you with this point. It has been over a century since we have freed slaves in this country. Must we wait another century for substantive gains among minorities?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ryan from Tsai, and I'm not white. I was really happy with the way this debate went. See, if I were on the affirmative side, I would have made this a sleazy battle of semantics. I would have said, listen, we can all agree that affirmative action is racist and is counterproductive and is morally inexcusable. But hey, it brings blacks into colleges, so that benefits minorities, much in the same way as, stealing benefits thieves or welfare benefits poor people. But no. That sort of point didn't come up. It was a good debate, and there were some good points. I want to address 3 of them. The first is how apparently life used to really, really suck for black people. So I'm going to get personal now and tell you what things were like for me as recently as 60 years ago. 60 years ago, I couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white people. I couldn't drink at the same water fountains as them. I couldn't even breathe the same air, which isn't very surprising when you learn that I wasn't alive 60 years ago. And neither were any black people who are in college right now, except for Evergreen students who are a little weird. Now, the second point I want to address is how apparently life really sucks for black people right now, which is bad. But you know who else life really sucks now? Underprivileged white people. And they have socioeconomic affirmative action, which is good, and black people have that as well. I'm fine with socioeconomic affirmative action that addresses social issues, not race. But unless the affirmative side can explain to me why some white inner city kid who has more bullet wounds than ribs needs a higher SAT score to get into college than, I know, a rich black kid who went to prep school, then, well, they're not proving that affirmative action is the best thing for public education after all. The third thing I want to address is this idea of diversity, which is apparently a great thing, and it is, but, you know, like giving $100 to everyone in this room, you can't do it without taking away from other people. I challenge the affirmative side to pick one deserving white kid in this room they'd like to throw out of college to make room for a random black kid. But anyway, you know, I'm clearly on the wrong side because everyone benefits from affirmative action. Black people do, white people do, Cubans do, Cherokee do, because if we get rid of racial quotas, you know, so many more coveted spaces and all the great colleges are going to go to those filthy Asians, and that's something none of us want.
Over here, thank you, sir.
Yeah, I don't know what that guy was on, man. Okay, yeah, I have a question and I also have a comment, so I don't know which order do I need to present that in.
I'd prefer you make the comment because it's an argument that we're looking for from the floor.
Okay. Okay, well, obviously I'm a black student. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. My name is Rebel Durley Petty, first-year grad student in the print journalism program. And lift this up, it's kind of short for me. Okay, this kind of really correlates with the question I wanted to ask, but for me, you know, I went to a Lutheran, I grew up in Lutheran school, so I had access to a very good education that really equipped me a lot better than the majority of my friends. You know, I went to a college preparatory school, and so actually the majority of the principles and the curriculum that I was taught really was already on the collegiate level. So when I actually got to college, it really wasn't anything to me. I know I really didn't struggle with it at all. It felt like I had been there and it was commonplace. But at the same time, I was also an athlete. I played basketball. I was recruited by a lot of universities. And I ended up attaining a 3-point GPA in high school, but I also ended up getting a 20 on my ACT. And so that was enough to qualify for a basketball scholarship, but for academic scholarship, the score really wasn't high enough. And so I really feel that aptitude tests are really overly emphasized in terms of their results, and they're really not indicative of what a student is capable of. Because after I graduated from high school, I went on to a community college. I made Phi Theta Kappa, who's who among college students, virtually every academic award possible. Then I went to the University of Northern Iowa, and I made Golden Key International Honor Society, Omicron Delta Kappa, National Dean's List, graduated with 3.67 GPA, which would have been higher if I didn't end up encountering some racist, prejudiced professors who ended up minimizing my grade just as a result of me being an outspoken black male because they were intimidated by that. And so I just really feel there's too much of an emphasis placed on aptitude tests because let's say a student gets into a university, that's only step one. You know, you also have to end up taking into account what type of financial provisions are going to be made by universities. That's a problem why you don't see that many Afro-American students here at Boston University. The city is 25% black, and the number of students here, percentage of black students, only 2.5%. I find that absolutely deplorable. It makes absolutely no sense to me, and I feel the university needs to do a better job of not only recruiting students, but really putting forth and offering the money in order to attain those students and make it a more diverse environment. Because I've been around students before who said they've only been around a couple of black people, and when I was at the University of Northern Iowa as well, I was around people who coming from farms, and there's nothing wrong with coming from a farm. You know, a lot of intelligent, good people who come from farms as well, so I don't look down on people from whatever background or environment they come from, but they simply hadn't been around black people or Hispanics before their entire life, and they really didn't even know how to handle it. They looked at me based off of my appearance, and you know, I say I dress hip-hop. You either see me in a ball cap, a headband every day, or a throwback jersey. That's just me, and that's my personality. But that
I've got
was
one question for
okay,
you.
okay. Let me finish it real quick. That was automatically equated with thuggishness and just me being an athlete, and people didn't really take me seriously until they heard me speak, and then they found out I was eloquent. But my question is, so really, what do you feel about students who are academically equipped to be successful at the collegiate level, and they're admitted into universities, but they aren't given those financial provisions to actually attend the university, which ostracizes them from the opportunity to have that education? And any member of the panel can answer that question.
We don't direct questions to the panel, but I'll direct a question to you. You came to me and said you would take your 308 course, or was it 722, one of the two, 722, if you could cover sports. You covering sports for your class?
Yes, sir.
You enjoying it?
Yeah, I am, in addition to other things. Got to be versatile.
Good, glad to catch up with you.
All right.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jillian Primiano. I'm a sophomore. I'm in CAS and I'm in COM. I agree with a lot of the reasoning behind affirmative action, but I disagree with you, Dean Elmore, in saying that we should ignore empiricism. I don't think that we should. There are, our negative speaker cited a statistic that said that the blacks who are and minorities who are benefiting from affirmative action are more likely to be from the higher tiers of society, from more wealthy homes, from more wealthy education backgrounds. And I think that's evidence that the discrepancies and disadvantages in our K through 12 education system are not necessarily only based on race, they're based on economics. And I think that in order for affirmative action to be fully accepted by white society and by intellectuals as a whole, it would have to be based more on economics than just race, because there are white people who are living in neighborhoods where the schools are not good enough, and where there are white people living in single-parent homes, and there are white people who live in crime-infested neighborhoods, and it's not fair just to say that black people are the only ones suffering from discrimination in the K through 12 education system.
Thank you.
To say.
Hi, my name is Ben Soa. I'm junior in CS. I'm biological anthropology major. I'm pre-med. Well, first, I'm not African American. I'm African, but I was born and raised in Europe. And I had one question, which was, if we don't apply affirmative action anymore, are we still going to have to put our race on our, I guess, college applications?
I believe that you don't have to put your race on today. You have there's a box on the application form, and you have the option of leaving it blank. It's information that the colleges obviously want to have for a variety of reasons, but it's not compulsory.
Okay, and also wanted to precise that black is not only a race, but it's what you carry on every day. Like you gave the example of Jews, for instance, that were discriminated against, but when you walk around, it's not written you're Jewish, but when you walk around, it's written you're black on yourself. So the discrimination goes not only getting into college, but then there in college, it's, I guess someone mentioned it before, but inequalities, it's not only getting into college that is the inequality, but it's then staying in college and living as a black person in college.
I just want to make a comment in way of correction. It may not be evident to some people what a Jew looks like, but the Nazis had no difficulty identifying 6 million of them. So it's a part of our experience.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Celia Risha, and I'm a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences. I grew up in Boston my whole life, and I went to Boston Public Schools, K through 12. I attended a high school that's in Dorchester. I now work in Roxbury and Dorchester with low-income families, and I also volunteer at Boston Public High School, helping high school children get into college. And I just wanted to share a statement that one of the students that I work with shared with me that very much so disturbed me. A bunch of the students went to a college visit at a high school somewhere in New England. I'm not going to mention the name of that school. And this student has a GPA of a 1.7. And I said, oh, you should really look at these schools because I'm not sure if you can get into these higher level schools because of your GPA and SAT score. And this student turned around and said to me, but I'm black. And the college counselors that we spoke to at the university said that they need black students and Hispanic students, and so that we have a chance we should apply, and that they will give us a lot of financial aid. And these college counselors then sat there and helped the students apply. And my main problem, I guess, with affirmative action is what it does to the worth ethic. The high school that I went to Boston Latin Academy, and it's a very rigorous program there. And I believe I'm a minority. I'm Middle Eastern, and I went to school with, I think the school was 40% white, 30% African American, 20% Hispanic, and so it was a very diverse high school. And I had a 4.0 GPA, I had very good SAT scores, I was in all the clubs possible, and yet I watched classmates that had 2.5s get into colleges that I didn't get into. And in a sense, that discouraged me, saying to myself, should I have really worked as hard? Because you can work hard and get an A on that test and you can study, and you can change your grade, but you can't change your nationality or what background you come from, or if you were born African American, if you're born Jewish American, Middle Eastern American, whatever. And so my main problem with it is worth ethic and what it teaches high school students from minority backgrounds.
Thank you. Let's make this the final comment, and then we'll have the summation by the panelists.
Yes, this is a comment. I am speaking from experience dealing with the workforce, having gone through affirmative action, living in Fall River, Massachusetts, where their affirmative action had been instated for a very long time. Speaking from experience and dealing with the workforce now, I think that we're not dealing in the essence of social problems. We're dealing with the fact that there's more of a network, a clique. If you don't fit in, it's not in the sense that you're black, you're white, you're Jewish, you're Middle Eastern, you're an Arab. It's more in the sense of what we're dealing with now is if you don't fit in, they won't hire you. Affirmative action is put in place for black people, but also for socioeconomic problems as well that are going on. But if you don't fit in, you don't fit in, and they're not going to hire you regardless, affirmative action or not. If they have their quota, it doesn't matter. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the comments that were made this evening. They were on point and worth hearing. Let's conclude the debate now with summations by the two lead debaters. First, arguing the negative side, Professor Rick Sander.
Well, it's been a good debate, and I've been inspired by a lot of the comments that I've heard. I'm going to try to answer as many of the questions and comments as I can in 10 minutes. First of all, is there racial injustice? Does race matter in American society? Absolutely. I thoroughly believe that. Professor Thurston thoroughly believes that. Both of us have done extensive work on trying to better understand what are the sources of racial inequality in American society and what are the most effective ways to address them. A lot of my work suggests that housing segregation is a major cause. Housing segregation tends to lead to the concentration of blacks and Hispanics in central city school districts, which are often underfunded and poorly staffed. Areas that have moved towards greater racial integration in parts of the United States have seen substantial narrowings of test score gaps. The test score gap, which is at the essence, at the heart of the affirmative action and higher education problem, is not a genetic effect. Blacks and Hispanics and whites are not intrinsically different. There are environmental, cultural, educational reasons that cause that gap, and we've got to address those. I'm absolutely committed to that. And maybe what I hear some of you thinking is, well, okay, so maybe affirmative action is not the greatest policy. In fact, maybe it's even counterproductive. But it is a policy. If we get rid of affirmative action, is that just going to increase social complacency? Well, we actually have a way of answering that question. We can look at the natural experiment that's been done in California. California passed Proposition 209 10 years ago, prohibiting the use of race in college admissions, among other things. Now, 209 is not a perfect natural experiment because many of the institutions covered by it have taken various measures to try to evade it. But nonetheless, we can look at that and we can see some things. We can see some effects. And let me tell you what a few of those are. The one that you tend to read about in the papers when 209 is discussed almost invariably is the large drop in Black and Hispanic enrollment at the most elite universities in the University of California system. That's Berkeley and UCLA, the place where I teach. And it's true that Black and Hispanic enrollments have fallen 50, 60, some years 70% from pre-209 days in those campuses. What you don't hear is that overall enrollment at University of California has gone up, moderately for blacks, but substantially for Hispanics. That's worth repeating. Overall enrollment at the University of California of minorities is higher now than it was before 209. Why is that? Well, part of it is what I call the cascade effect, which is that if you substantially reduce preferences, then there are fewer minorities at the most elite institutions, but a lot of those minorities end up going to less elite institutions where they are able to get in on their own credentials. That's what you've seen in the UC system. You see some of the schools like Davis and San Diego and Riverside having huge increases in enrollment from students who formerly were going to Berkeley and UCLA. Now, if my argument is correct, then what I ought to see as a result of that, better performance at those schools and higher graduation rates. Information is incomplete, but the information we do have is completely consistent with this. UC San Diego has seen a 50% drop in the gap between graduation rates between blacks and whites over the last 10 years. UC Davis has seen a sharp drop in performance differences between blacks and whites at the undergraduate level. So it is having that effect. But what effect is it having on broader society? Is it leading Californians to be more complacent about racial injustice? Well, one of the big underreported stories of Prop 209 is that immediately after its passage, the university started spending tens of billions of dollars doing things they had never done before. Getting faculty and students involved in trying to improve K through 12 education in California. Trying to expand the pool. They realized that they couldn't just pick the high SES Black and Hispanic students to make the campuses look racially diverse. The only way they could do it is start using things like socioeconomic preferences and build the pool of low-income students who were strong enough to get into the campuses. So they've started vast programs of outreach. They've started making admission programs far more heterogeneous. University of Michigan and University of Virginia have about 13% of their students on Pell Grants. Those are the federal grants for low-income students. Berkeley and UCLA have 33 and 37% of their students on Pell Grants, respectively. In other words, they are not being complacent as a result of reducing or eliminating affirmative action. They are moving towards new types of initiatives that are actually aimed at getting at the roots of racial injustice. So I don't think that reducing affirmative action is a recipe for complacency. A few other points. Someone raised the issue about Hispanics. What does happen with Hispanics? Well, very simply, Hispanics generally receive preferences about half the size of blacks. That's generally what universities use to try to achieve what they see as a reasonable racial representation. The SES dilemmas that exist with black preferences exist fully with Hispanics, because Hispanics are in many ways an even more heterogeneous population. So third and fourth and fifth generation Hispanic Americans tend disproportionately to benefit from these preferences. First generation Mexican immigrants tend not to get those racial preferences. Someone mentioned the workforce. There's, my own research has found that blacks who get the largest preferences earn on average about $10,000 less when they actually get into the legal market than blacks who receive small preferences or no preferences. There's a study by two eminent social scientists that looked at data on undergraduates. And they were of two minds. They said, well, either going to a less elite school doesn't hurt your earnings at all, given the increase in your grades, or it actually increases your earnings. So again, the empirical evidence is pretty striking that giving huge preferences, if it results in poor GPA performance, doesn't do the job. What about the social impact of diversity? What about the social goals to try to have an integrated campus setting? Again, that's totally praiseworthy. I mean, I went to California in the first place, partly because I wanted to experience greater diversity than I could find in Midwestern schools. But if you create diversity artificially through very large preferences, and it's accompanied by big performance differences, that's obviously going to have some negative impacts in social interaction. It can lead to a feeling of alienation and self-segregation by minorities. It can lead to reinforcements of negative stereotypes by whites and Asians who see blacks and Hispanics not competing as well as they are. Unjustifiably negative stereotypes, because as I've said, if you admit without regard to race, you see the same performance levels at schools. So it can have the exact opposite types of social effects that we want to have from it. So we've got to think about policies in terms of whether or not they work. 40 years is actually a pretty long time to try a social experiment in America. It's time for us to think about something new. It's time for us to think about phasing out preferences along Justice O'Connor's timeline, forcing universities to say, okay, this is not going to go on forever. We've got to start thinking of alternatives. We've either got to figure out how to raise the performance of the students that we admit, or we've got to come up with better ways of fueling the pipeline, or we've got to think of alternatives of what it means to equalize opportunity in the United States. That's the message that I leave you with. I think that we have to examine affirmative action policies. We've got to come up with, it's time to come up with better alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, and Professor Coleman, the final speaker of this evening's program.
Well, as I predicted, they didn't say a single word about what the purpose of public education is, although they've done a lot of talk about the failure of affirmative action, but it seems to me very difficult to talk about whether something succeeds without talking about what the purpose or the goal of public education is. Rick just talked about, he says, you know, if you get rid of affirmative action, that's not a recipe for complacency. And he talked about the overall enrollment increasing at the University of the California higher education system. And then he sort of slipped in, well, but yeah, it has sort of decreased at the elite institutions. This is nothing more than just a sophisticated, patronizing, separate but equal argument. I've never felt stigmatized by my Harvard degree. It's always been my race. People who know nothing about me and people who know nothing about other black people or brown people or Asians make judgments about them based on their race. So this idea that somehow you know, we're going to be stigmatized with a Harvard degree because we're black, well, that's just that's just out of touch with reality. You know, they keep saying that, you know, low grades. This is about low grades and about racial preferences, but it's not about race. And it's not that, you know, racial minorities can't do well. It's that they don't do well. You know, one suggestion is, well, you know, why don't they do well, and why do we have to rely on these policies? And one of the things that they point to, they say, well, it's because of the shameless failure of the society to address the fundamental problem in public education. And that what we ought to be doing, what Harvard and BU and, you know, Stanford and all these other institutions ought to be doing, is devoting more resources to improving the schools. Here's the question: when is that going to happen? You know, some of the people, some of the most vocal opponents of affirmative action are the same people who opposed racial integration in the 1950s. So, you know, this notion that all of a sudden now they're in favor of equal education is just that, well, you know, these people aren't prepared, they aren't as well prepared, and we're trying to protect them from their foolish decisions. I never said anything about affirmative action being about giving a hand to socioeconomic disadvantaged people. That's not a goal of affirmative action. That may be something that we want to do, but that's not what this debate was about. But I wonder, why is it that they think that it would be okay to bring in poor people who are not as well prepared as their white counterparts, but not black people who are not as well prepared? Are they going to do better? You know, Rick has the data, so I assume that at some point he'll get around to addressing that. Are poor people or are racial minorities or white students who are poor, who are less prepared because of that, admitted to these elite schools doing better, and will that benefit them? Because if it won't, then why are we going to do that? We ought to say that, look, the elite universities are just for the people who are well prepared, and if that excludes minorities and that excludes poor white people, well, that's just the way it is. Rather than, you know, engage in this sophisticated argument suggesting that we wouldn't oppose it if it was about socioeconomic status. Rick said with a straight face that black students would be better off going to a school for which their credentials are better matched than going to an elite school through race-conscious policies. He says because many of them, not all of them, but many of them, he says, will graduate in the bottom 10th of their class. I doubt that for the people who get a Harvard degree or who have a choice between a Harvard degree and a degree from Waco State College will feel that graduating in the bottom 10th of their class at Harvard is not a benefit. The question is whether graduating from Harvard is a benefit wherever you are in the class. You know, I doubt that white legacies such as our president, George Bush, who finished in the bottom of his class at Yale, believe that he would have been better off if he had attended Waco State College in Texas. And I doubt that Rick's data will convince him that he was wrong. Now, Rick's talked about you know, the research that he's done on law firms, and I actually know something about that because I was at a law firm, an elite law firm. I was a partner there. And what Rick says is that his data show that the reason black lawyers don't do well is because they don't have high grades, as if the only factor that matter in success in a law firm is grades. If you read the paper that he's done, though, he acknowledges that there are a lot of other factors that determine whether you will succeed at a law firm, grades perhaps being a proxy for some of them. But the idea that grades alone determine the success in a law firm is absurd. And in fact, I've told him I thought it was irresponsible to suggest that. He understands that in order to really know what accounts for the failure or success of any lawyer, not just minority lawyers in these law firms, requires knowing something about the individual law firms, knowing something about the policies, knowing something about the work, knowing something about how work is evaluated, how it's distributed. He acknowledges that, but he says, well, the reason he didn't do that is because, well, these law firms aren't going to give him access to that data, so he'll just ignore it. It seems to me that that's irresponsible. If an explanation is important, then it seems to me that he ought to do the work necessary to get the explanation and not just simply conclude based on his limited data that it's really about grades. One of the things that he does in his study is that he looks at how quickly minority lawyers in these big law firms start to think about leaving. And what he finds is that they start to think about leaving much earlier in their careers at the firm than white lawyers. And he concludes from that, implicitly at least, that they must realize that, that they're in over their heads, and so they need to go someplace where they're going to be better matched. That's one explanation. The other explanation may be that they realize that they're not getting the opportunities and they're not getting the support that's necessary for success, and they start to think about doing something different because why waste your career at a place that's not providing you the opportunities to succeed? So it seems to me that it seems to me that, again, if Rick is really interested in why people don't succeed in law firms or why they do succeed, he ought to have a standard against which to measure that and not simply make conclusions based on what even he admits is limited data. It seems to me that those who benefit from affirmative action are in the best position to decide whether that those who have been admitted to these elite universities and who have graduated are in the best position to determine whether it was a benefit. And my guess would be, without having the data, that most of them will say that they're better off having a Harvard degree than they would be having a degree from Suffolk University. Thank you.
Where are you going, Pam? My wife was sneaking out. She's voting with her feet. She probably wishes she had done it 38 years. Well, okay. We're going to divide up here according to whom you feel won the debate, not necessarily which side you personally support. Those who feel that the affirmative side won the debate, please gather over here to my right. Those who feel that the negative point of view on this proposition won the debate, gather to my left. I will call the result very quickly.
You're watching The Great Debate, brought to you by Boston University's College of Communication. The question before the group here has been, does affirmative action in higher education really benefit minorities? The audience is dividing on either side of the question. We shall see who wins.
I am I don't know.
Professor Robert Zelnick is trying to make a determination as
Anybody
to which
count
side
here?
has more students adhering
I'm
to
not
it.
going to call another draw unless I get permission from department chairman here. I think the negative side has a few more people on it, so I'm going to call the negative side the winner in this debate, not necessarily the winner on the issue, but the winner of the debate. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Be very careful getting home.
You can go to www.bu.edu/com and see the results of a poll that we have been taking throughout the debate. The question being, does affirmative action in higher education really benefit minorities? This is The Great Debate at Boston University's College of Communication. Have a good evening.